So some of you know that I've been spending some time this winter and spring up at the State House in Concord testifying about access to abortion care. Sometimes in those rooms there have been several faith leaders, that's my favorite, but there have been a couple times when it's just been two, me and the lobbyist from the Catholic diocese. We have slightly different opinions. Now, the first time this happened, I felt a little bit like my life had come full circle. You see, I grew up in a very Catholic area of Minnesota, which was filled with single-issue voters. What that meant is that they would vote for whoever was against access to abortion care. It didn't matter what other issues that politician supported or opposed, and it didn't matter how many issues they agreed or disagreed with. It was all decided by that one hot button issue. Now, this infuriated me as a teenager. It still kind of does. And it infuriated me in part because I had learned enough to know that Catholic social teaching is so much more than that single issue. I went to Catholic school for 6 years, and one of the classes I got to take was about social justice. We learned about the principles of Catholic social teaching, several of which are actually quite radical. You can go look them up this afternoon if you don't know them. They talk about preferencing the needs of the poor and vulnerable, respecting the dignity of workers, solidarity for all humankind, and the care of creation. It was from those teachings that liberation theology emerged. That idea that God preferences the needs of the poor and vulnerable was interpreted to mean that God was on the side of the oppressed and marginalized. So in that Catholic social justice class, I learned about people like Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was killed because of his work in the name of Catholicism, because of his work on behalf of marginalized folks in his country. He did that work in the name of Catholicism, in the name of Jesus. I was inspired by that even as a Unitarian Universalist teenager, inspired by the way Archbishop Romero lived his faith and how it led him to try to change the world. And then I looked around me, and what I saw was not people following in the footsteps of Archbishop Romero, but instead focusing on that single issue. They would vote for candidates who supported all kinds of policies that did the opposite of what Catholic social teaching was all about, simply because they were anti-abortion. In many ways, it was this juxtaposition that has inspired the way I work for justice as a faith leader. In college, I got really interested in interfaith organizing, in coming together as people of different faiths to speak clearly about what our values call us to work for, and the way they call us to work for a better world. I liked that even though we didn't agree on everything, we could find common ground. We could get to know each other as people and find ways to collaborate on those places where we did agree. Having done organizing in both faith and secular spaces, I've always found that faith spaces are able to do a better job of what Carl talked about in his reflection, naming the positive of what we are working for, rather than getting stuck in what we are working against. There is something about having the language and the values of faith that lends itself to that positive, more inspirational spin on things. Faith-based justice work is able to be the kind of resistance that Starhawk wrote about in our chalice lighting. When we do more than defy reality, we present its alternatives, communicating our beliefs and values. There is a lot of good in the concept of finding common ground, whether or not we do it in faith spaces. It keeps us away from the dangers of us and them thinking, and from the intense polarization that we hear so much about in the news these days. In our story today about the wall in the middle of the book, the main character illustrates quite charmingly the fallacy of thinking that we are safe and they are not. He is so scared of what he has decided is on the other side of the wall that he doesn't even notice when his side of the wall is trying to drown him. And then, once he finally meets the ogre on the other side of the wall, he realizes that the ogre is actually pretty fun. It is a beautiful little fable about not vilifying the other side. And yet, finding common ground is not actually as easy or as picturesque as the story of that wall in the middle of the book. Sometimes the ogre does want to eat you. Sometimes you do need the protection of the wall. Sometimes there is, in fact, danger and harm on the other side. Polarization has its dangers, but simply relying on an idyllic vision of finding common ground has its dangers as well. The thing is that we do actually hold different beliefs about the world, about humanity, about what the best course for our future might be. And I do think that some of those beliefs are not okay, that they bring harm, that they spread hatred instead of love. Sometimes when I'm in UU spaces with other ministers or religious professionals, we get into this recurring debate about whether or not we like the slogan, "Side with love." This is the phrase that has been used at the national UU level to unite our UU social justice work for several years now. I know that I have colleagues who don't like the phrase, who say that love has no sides, who say that it is anti-universalist. And I have to say, I disagree pretty strongly with that. I do think that love takes sides. That doesn't mean that any person is outside the bounds of love, but it does mean that there are beliefs and actions that are outside the bounds of love, that are unequivocally not okay. Now, I know it may sound a little anathema for a UU to say that some beliefs are not okay. We are, after all, known for tolerance, for the acceptance of a diversity of beliefs, but there is a limit to our tolerance. And I think in many ways that limit is intolerance. This question of whether or not we tolerate intolerance is one I've been wrestling with since college when I took a class on religious diversity and American identity. In that class, we explored the myriad of religions in the US and considered how they do or do not fit into American identity. We talked about tolerance for all religions being a central part of that identity. And we talked about the limits of tolerance. What becomes challenging in this conversation is that whenever you say that you can't tolerate intolerance, there'll be someone who comes along and says, "Wait a minute, then you are the one who is intolerant," right? To put it in simpler or maybe like millennial terms, if you hate the hater, then you become the hater too, right? Now, this is a lot of what I hear people rail against, what I hear when people rail against the polarization in our country right now. It is certainly true that there are vastly different ways of thinking about what our future as a country should look like. And it is also certainly true that there is a lot of vilification happening on all sides. But I don't think the answer to that is simply about finding common ground, or about listening and acknowledging the validity of everyone's opposing views. That may be part of the answer, but I also think that some calls for common ground can be harmful, can mask the real pain and suffering that particular positions cause. Now, I love interfaith organizing, and I'm not about to stop doing it. But I'm going to be honest and tell you that I'm finding it increasingly difficult to be in spaces with people who use their faith to deny the dignity and rights of LGBTQ folks. Unlike some other issues out there where there may be a variety of valid points of view, this is not an issue that I think is negotiable or a matter of opinion. When it is a question of the fullness of someone's humanity, our faith is actually very clear. There is no debate about the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I have a colleague who sometimes says that the middle ground between oppression and liberation is still oppression. And I'm all about compromise in a lot of ways, but I am not about compromising our deeply held values in the name of tolerance, or getting along, or getting past polarization. I'm all about finding common ground to work together for a more just world when it will make us more powerful and more effective, but I'm not interested in that if it means tolerating hatred and discrimination. I am not entirely sure what the solution is to all of this, but I know that I'm not ready to give up on either part of this. I don't want to give up on our common ground because I think that there is something so powerful about it. I work with other people of faith who I disagree with about some things because I know that joining our forces together makes us more powerful. It increases our capacity to make a difference in the world. And I do really believe that relationship with one another is the best way to increase our capacity for love. At the same time, I'm not ready to give up on my deeply held values. I don't want to be in spaces where people I love are not loved and respected for the fullness of who they are. I don't want to be in spaces where I know that if I held different identities, I would not be welcome. And I think perhaps what I am called to here is not to leave these spaces, but to be less quiet in them, to name the discomfort rather than letting it be. Last spring, I did exactly that in my role as president of the New Hampshire Council of Churches. We were beginning a discussion about discerning a new mission for the council. And in the conversation, I said, I just want to name that it feels like there are a couple things that are really important to my faith values, and I feel like we avoid talking about them here. Specifically, LGBTQ rights and abortion access. Now, there was a little discomfort when I said that. Not because of what anyone there actually believed, it turned out, but because these have been hard issues for people of faith. And some of the denominations who were in the room are still struggling with them. I was really nervous about naming it because I really cared about these people, and we had done good work together. But it opened up a conversation about whether we were more interested in unity or justice. And it took us down a path of discernment to a new mission statement and set of values that explicitly names working for LGBTQ rights as a part of who we are. As a result of that discernment, this spring, the Council of Churches has been able to show up officially for the first time ever at the State House as trans and non-binary folks have been threatened with a slew of bills meant to take away their right to exist. It was so powerful for me to see people of faith showing up in force in support of our trans and non-binary siblings, in the name of their faith and in the name of love. In our work for justice as people of faith, I don't think the question is really, should we find common ground or should we be grounded deeply in our values? Because the answer to all of that is yes. We need both. The exact right path of resistance is a delicate balance. It's not falling into the path of least resistance, simply living with the status quo, but it's also not vilifying the other side, resisting so fiercely that I give the other side more power. We have to strive to find something in between, not the middle ground between oppression and liberation, but the middle ground of resistance. And so, may we all strive to find that delicate balance with faithfulness and with love as we work for a world that embodies the values that we hold so dear.